Under the pale light of the Grayson estate, snow pressed against the tall windows like a quiet storm. The house seemed alive with silence, its walls echoing wealth and absence in equal measure. Grace Carter stepped inside for the first time that night, her worn suitcase trailing a whisper across the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of cedar and money. Somewhere upstairs a baby was crying. It wasn't the sharp cry of hunger. It was a cry that begged for something the house could not give. The butler spoke little as he led her through the halls. Nurseries at the end, he said. And then he was gone. Grace followed the sound. Inside the nursery, the light was dim, the kind of gold that turns loneliness visible. A small girl, maybe two, lay in a crib too large for her size. Her tiny fists trembled in the air. Grace reached down careful and touched her back. The crying stopped for a breath, then started again, louder. No one came. She lifted the child without thinking, holding her close, humming an old tune she barely remembered from the foster home. Within minutes, the girl's sobs softened. Her breathing steadied, and her body went heavy in Grace's arms. Grace sat on the rug, rocking slowly. The child's warmth seeped through her thin uniform. For a moment, she forgot she was just a maid. Then the door burst open. Ethan Grayson stood there like a shadow carved from anger. Tall, precise, wrapped in an expensive suit that looked as tired as his eyes. His voice cut through the room. "What the hell do you think you were doing?" The baby, startled, whimpered. Grace froze. She wouldn't sleep, she whispered. She kept crying. Ethan stepped forward, snatched the child from her arms. "You don't touch her. You serve you clean. You stay out of the way." The baby screamed. It was piercing, almost desperate. Ethan's jaw tightened. He tried to soothe her, but the crying only grew. Grace's voice was soft, firm. "She's scared. Give her back." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with something like defeat flickering in his face, Ethan handed the baby to her. Instantly, the child calmed, her tiny hand gripping Grace's shirt, breathing slow and sure. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting. Ethan stared at them, this stranger and his daughter, as if seeing a truth he didn't want. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. "Put her down when she's asleep," he said quietly, and left the room without another word. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay on the small cot in the corner of her quarters, listening to the winter wind press against the windows. The house made no sound. It was a palace built on emptiness. Somewhere above her, the child was sleeping, and for reasons she couldn't name, Grace felt responsible for keeping that peace. Morning came slow. The staff moved like ghosts, polished silver, and avoided eye contact, Mrs. Porter, the head housekeeper, gave Grace a look that wasn't unkind but carried warning. "Mr. Grayson doesn't like surprises," she said while arranging dishes. "Do what's asked and nothing more." Grace nodded. She'd heard that sentence her whole life. Later that afternoon, she found herself in the kitchen washing bottles. A soft laugh broke the monotony. Angie, another maid, leaned against the counter. "You survived your first night. That's more than most do." Grace managed a small smile. "How many have quit?" Angie shrugged. Enough that the baby stopped learning names. That night, the crying started again. Grace waited. She wanted to respect boundaries, the invisible rules written into houses like this. But after 20 minutes of that desperate wail, she climbed the stairs. Ethan was there, standing by the crib, looking helpless. He didn't turn when she entered. "She won't stop," he muttered. "She doesn't want to be alone." Grace stepped forward. "May I?" He hesitated, then stepped aside. The baby reached for Grace, instantly clinging like she remembered her. Within seconds, she was asleep. Ethan watched, wordless. The next morning at breakfast, he didn't look at her. He didn't have to. The silence between them was louder than apology. But Mrs. Porter saw. She saw the way he glanced toward the hallway whenever Ella's laugh echoed from upstairs. She saw the way his hands trembled when he poured coffee as if holding on to something too fragile. Days passed. Grace found rhythm in routine polish, fold, feed, sing. She learned Ella's moods, her small rituals, the way she pressed her cheek against Grace's shoulder before falling asleep. Sometimes late at night, Grace caught her own reflection in the nursery window and barely recognized the woman staring back. There was softness there she thought life had already taken from her. One evening, Ethan returned early from the city. Snow fell heavier now, covering the long drive in silence. He paused outside the nursery door. Through the crack, he saw Grace sitting on the rug, Ella in her lap, humming low and gentle. The child's tiny hand rested against her chest. Ethan didn't enter. He just listened. Something in him ached in a place he hadn't felt since before the funeral. The next day he appeared at the doorway while she folded laundry. "You sing every night?" he asked. She straightened. "If she cries, does it always work every time?" He nodded once, awkward, then walked away. That night, no crying came from upstairs. The house slept peacefully for the first time in months. Winter deepened. Grace found small traces of warmth in unexpected corners, a mug of cocoa left on the counter. A note from Mrs. Porter, thanking her for staying, a rare smile from Ethan when their paths crossed. Still the distance held. He was polite but unreachable, a man made of walls. She didn't try to climb them until the night the power went out. The storm outside roared like the sea. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the mansion into darkness. Grace rushed to the nursery. Ella was awake, whimpering. She scooped her up, grabbed a blanket, and searched for candles. Ethan appeared with a flashlight, his expression tight. "Backup generators down," he said. "Stay put." But when he saw them, Grace sitting by the fireplace, the baby bundled in her arms, candlelight trembling across her face, something inside him faltered. He set the flashlight down, crouched nearby. The fire crackled softly. "She only sleeps when you hold her," he murmured. Grace nodded. "She knows who's safe." He looked into the flames. Her mother used to say the same. The room went quiet. Outside the wind howled. Inside warmth grew. Later, as the fire dimmed, Grace shifted Ella onto a small cot near the hearth. She spread her own coat over the child and lay beside her on the floor. Ethan lingered a moment longer, watching the two shapes outlined by fading light. Then he did something unexpected. He took another blanket, covered them gently, and whispered, "Thank you." When morning came, the storm had passed. The house looked softer, as if the snow itself had decided to forgive. Ethan stood at the window, coffee untouched, staring at the garden buried in white. He thought about the woman sleeping upstairs, about how easily she'd stepped into chaos and found calm. That afternoon he called her into his office. Grace entered cautiously. The room smelled of leather and cold air. "I owe you an apology," he said. She blinked, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "For what? For last week?" "For everything." He looked down, fingers tracing the edge of his desk. "You did nothing wrong. I just forgot what kindness looked like." She said nothing, only nodded. Sometimes silence was the only forgiveness a man could handle. From that day, the rhythm shifted. Ethan began having breakfast at the table instead of behind a closed office door. He asked Grace's opinion about small things, the kind of baby food Ella liked, what lullabies she sang. One morning he mentioned a project, Unity, he called it, a digital hub for single mothers, resources, counseling, support networks. "I started it after Lauren died, but the team doesn't understand what these women really need." Grace listened quietly. "And you think I do?" "You live what they live," he said simply. "You know what it feels like to be left behind." That night, she thought about his words while tucking Ella into her crib. Left behind. It was the story of her life. But maybe for the first time, she wasn't standing on the outside of someone else's world. Days turned into weeks. The house thawed just a little. Laughter returned in fragments. Ella's giggle when Ethan made silly faces, Grace's small smiles when the child toddled after her. Mrs. Porter watched it all with quiet satisfaction. "He's changing," she told Angie one afternoon. Angie grinned. "Love or guilt doesn't matter," Mrs. Porter replied. Change is change. Yet even warmth carries shadows. Grace knew it each night. She folded her uniform each morning. She reminded herself this wasn't her home. She had learned not to mistake gratitude for belonging. Still, when Ethan passed her in the hallway and said, "Good morning, Grace," she couldn't ignore the flicker in her chest. One evening, near the end of January, the house lost power again. But this time, Ethan didn't retreat to his office. He joined them in the nursery carrying an extra blanket and 2 mugs of tea. "Thought you might need this," he said. Grace took it, surprised. Ella lay half asleep in her lap, clutching a stuffed bear. The fire cast soft light across Ethan's face, revealing not power, but exhaustion. He sat beside them close enough for the silence to feel human. "She's growing fast," Grace said quietly. "Children do that when they feel safe." Ethan looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You've done more for her than anyone since Lauren." Grace shook her head. "I just stayed." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Outside, snow fell like forgiveness. Inside, warmth lingered longer than it should have. Grace didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She only knew that for the first time in years, she wasn't surviving through another man's anger or indifference. She was living inside a moment that felt almost like hope. When she finally returned to her room, she found something on her bed. A small book cloth bound tied with a blue ribbon. No note, no name. She opened it. Inside, in careful handwriting, were the words, "You deserve to be more than someone who survives." She stared at the sentence until it blurred, then closed the book and held it to her chest. Somewhere down the hall, a child sighed in her sleep. Somewhere deeper in the house, a man sat alone, wondering if it was too late to start again. The Grayson estate slept under a blanket of snow, but the frost on its windows no longer seemed as thick. The air had changed. Something unseen had begun to move through the hall, soft, cautious, real. A house that had forgotten warmth was learning how to remember. Excellent, I'll now write part 2. 3,000 words in English, following your cinematic and rhythmic style from part 1, but with more intensity, faster rhythm, and an emotional tension as the story rises through its twists and the climaxes. There will be no titles, no dashes, and no breaks, written as one continuous piece for voiceover performance. Snow melted from the city roofs as February arrived, and the Grayson estate no longer looked frozen. Grace Carter began to notice the sound of life again. Laughter from the nursery footsteps that were not hurried. The distant ring of a phone that wasn't always business. The house had softened, but beneath that calm something restless began to stir. Ethan Grayson was different now, more present, almost uncertain in his own home. He still moved like a man trained to hide feeling, but his voice carried hesitation instead of command. Grace saw it most in the way he watched Ella, how every laugh from the child startled him, like music from a world he thought was gone. For weeks they lived in that delicate balance between comfort and something unnamed. Until the morning, everything changed. Grace was feeding Ella oatmeal in the sunlit kitchen when Mrs. Porter appeared pale and breathless. A car had stopped at the gate. A woman stepped out wrapped in a gray coat, her eyes covered by dark glasses. She said her name was Lauren. The room fell silent. Grace froze spoon halfway to the child's mouth. She had heard the name whispered in corridors, the ghost who still owned half the air Ethan breathed. Now she was back. Ethan came down the stairs moments later, disbelief in his eyes. Lauren stood by the door, fragile but composed. Her face was thinner than the photos on the walls, her voice barely a whisper. "I came to see my daughter." Grace instinctively pulled Ella close. The child studied the stranger, blinked, then began to cry. Ethan stepped forward, uncertain. "Lauren, she doesn't remember." The woman's smile trembled. "Then we'll remind her." She reached out. Ella turned away, her small hands clutching Grace's sleeve. The sound of her sobs filled the room. Lauren froze, hurt flashing through her face. Grace whispered, "She's scared. It's been so long." Lauren's hand fell. The silence stretched until Ethan guided her toward the study. Grace took Ella upstairs, her heart pounding. She tried to focus on calming the baby, but her own hands shook. Downstairs, voices rose and fell behind closed doors. Hours passed before Ethan reappeared. His expression was carved from stone. "She'll stay for a few days," he said quietly, "until we decide what's best for Ella." Grace nodded, but her stomach turned cold. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. Lauren moved through the house like a ghost trying to reclaim life. She was kind, even gentle, but Ella avoided her, hiding behind Grace's legs. Ethan tried to bridge the distance, arranging breakfasts, together walks in the garden, bedtime stories. None of it worked. One night, Lauren found Grace rocking Ella to sleep and whispered, "She loves you more than me." Grace started to speak, but Lauren shook her head. "Don't. You've given her what I couldn't." Her eyes glistened with tears. The next morning, Lauren was gone. Her car never reached the city. The police called hours later. A crash on the frozen highway. Ethan didn't speak for 2 days. The house fell silent again. Grace kept Ella close, singing softly through the nights, listening for footsteps that never came. On the third evening, Ethan appeared in the doorway. His eyes red, his voice raw. "She left me once before, but this time Maid feels like she took the air with her." Grace stood in the middle of the room holding Ella, and for a moment neither spoke. Then she said, "You still have someone who needs you breathing." Grief changed him. It made him restless, angry, quieter, all at once. He buried himself in work, locking himself in his office for hours. Grace noticed something strange then. Packages arriving late at night, phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the hall. Unfamiliar men in suits visiting the estate. She didn't ask. Until one afternoon, she overheard Colin Ward, the company's chief financial officer, talking to Ethan near the library. His tone was slick, urgent. "Investors want results. If we delay again, Unity collapses." Ethan's reply was colder. "I won't launch a project built on lies." Colin smiled in a way that made Grace's skin crawl. "Then someone else will." That night, she searched online, curiosity turning into suspicion. Articles about Grayson Tech appeared with strange financial reports. Numbers that didn't add up. Donations missing from the Unity Fund. Grace wasn't trained in finance, but she understood deceit. She had lived with it her whole life. She copied the data, printed it, and hid it under her mattress. The next morning, Ethan found her in the kitchen, distracted. "Something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head. He studied her face. "You're not a good liar, Grace." She looked up. "And you're not a good actor." For the first time in days, he smiled. But that night, as she tucked Ella in, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone else in the house was watching them. 2 nights later, she discovered her room had been searched. The papers she hid were gone. Panic spread like fire through her chest. She ran to Ethan's office, but he wasn't there. Only Colin sat behind the desk, typing on the computer, as if it were his own. He looked up slowly. "You're curious for a maid," he said. Grace's throat tightened. "What did you take?" He leaned back, smiling. "Nothing you can prove." She tried to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Careful, Miss Carter. People who dig too deep tend to get buried." The next morning, Ethan called for her. Colin says you've been accessing company data. Is that true? Grace's heart raced. I was worried. I found irregularities in the Unity accounts. Ethan's expression darkened. You what? She held her ground. You said this project mattered. I wanted to protect it. He exhaled sharply. Leave the business to me. I can't have rumors or scandals. The words got sharper than he meant. She nodded, one's eyes burning, and left the room. That night, she packed her small bag. But when she went to the nursery to say goodbye, Ella woke up and reached for her. Mama, the child whispered her first word in days. Grace sank to the floor, tears blurring her vision. She couldn't leave. Not yet. The next morning, the world broke again. It started as a normal day. Reporters outside the gates press conference in the City Unity's public launch. Ethan and Colin were to appear together. Grace stayed behind with Ella. At noon, a sudden silence fell through the estate. She heard footsteps, hurried voices. Mrs. Porter burst into the kitchen. The child, she's gone. Grace's blood turned to ice. She ran upstairs, the crib empty, the window slightly open. Cold wind blew through. She screamed for help, her voice echoing through every hall. Security cameras showed Colin leaving minutes earlier, carrying a small bundle. Grace grabbed a coat and ran outside before anyone could stop her. The snow was falling again, light but endless. She followed tire tracks down the driveway, through the side gate, into the woods behind the property. Her lungs burned, her legs shaking. At the far edge of the estate, she saw them. Colin stood on the old observation deck overlooking the frozen lake, Ella in his arms. Let her go, Grace shouted. He turned his grin thin as glass. Relax. I just need the boss to remember who holds his fortune together. You're insane, she said. You'll destroy him. Colin laughed. He destroyed himself the day he hired a woman who thinks she belongs here. Grace took a slow step forward. Give me the baby. Why would I? He said, tightening his grip. Ella whimpered, small arms flailing. Because she's not part of your war, Grace said. Her voice shook but didn't break. You want money? Take it. You want revenge? Take it. But don't use her. For a moment he hesitated, something flickering in his expression. Then Ethan's voice came from behind them. Let her go, Colin. The older man spun around, startled. Ethan stepped onto the deck, unarmed, eyes steady. You think I don't know what you've done? I have every record. The police are on their way. Colin sneered. Then we'll all go down together. In that instant, Grace moved. She lunged forward, grabbing Ella as Colin turned. They stumbled as the railing groaned, snow slid underfoot. Ethan caught Grace's arm, pulling them both back as the deck splintered. Colin slipped, clutching the rail. For a heartbeat, he hung there. Then the wood gave way. The sound of breaking ice echoed through the trees. Ethan dragged Grace and the child to safety, both of them shaking, breathing in gasps. Ella clung to her neck, crying. He wrapped his coat around them, whispering, It's over. The police came hours later. Colin's body was pulled from the shallow edge of the lake. The news spread quickly. Ethan refused interviews. Grace gave a statement and returned to the house numb. That night she sat by the fire, Ella asleep on her lap, the world quiet again. Ethan entered slowly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked exhausted but alive. You saved her, he said. Grace shook her head. You did. No, he said softly. You're the only reason either of us survived this. The next week, the company board met in emergency session. Colin's crimes had surfaced, but so had Grace's courage. Ethan presented the evidence she'd gathered, giving her full credit. In a move that shocked everyone, he announced Grace Carter as the new community director for Unity. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, her name spread across headlines. She faced microphones for the first time, nervous but steady. When asked why she stayed loyal to a company that had nearly destroyed her, she said, because survival isn't living. We deserve to be seen. The clip went viral overnight. Back at the estate, Ethan found her in the garden, watching Ella chase snowflakes. "They love you out there," he said. She smiled faintly. "They love the story." "You are the story," he replied. She turned to him, searching his face. "What happens when the story ends?" "Then we write another one," he said. Days passed in fragile peace. Reporters, future investors returned. Unity's first outreach centers opened across the country. Grace worked tirelessly, balancing her new role and her life with Ella. Yet she could feel something unfinished between her and Ethan, something waiting beneath the surface. One afternoon, a visitor arrived. An older woman, her hair silver, her hands trembling as she held a small envelope. "I'm looking for Grace Carter," she said. Grace met her in the foyer. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "You look just like her," she whispered. "Who?" Grace asked softly. "Your mother." The words barely reached her ears. "I'm her," the woman said. "I lost you to the system 20 years ago. I never stopped searching." Grace's world tilted. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The woman reached out, and this time Grace didn't step back. The hug was awkward, fragile, but real. Ethan watched from the stairs, silent, understanding that some reunions heal wounds no wealth ever could. That evening, Grace sat by the fire with her mother and Ella, 3 generations bound by accident and grace. She told Ethan later, "She thought I was dead. I thought the same of her. Now maybe we can both live." He nodded, eyes soft. "You built something bigger than unity." But even as peace returned, darkness lingered at the edges. Collins' allies in the press released half-truths, insinuations that Grace had manipulated Ethan, that the Unity project was a redemption scam. Online whispers turned cruel. Grace tried to ignore them, but the weight grew daily. Late one night, she found Ethan in his office reading the comments on a glowing screen. "They'll destroy you," she said. "Let them try," he replied. "Truth takes longer to trend, but it lasts." The following morning, he surprised her again. A press conference unannounced. The world watched as Ethan stood before cameras, Grace beside him, Ella on her hip. He spoke clearly. "This company stands because one woman reminded me what it means to have a heart. If anyone questions her worth, they can question mine first." The audience erupted. It was the moment the story turned from scandal to redemption. That night, the 3 of them walked the garden path under melting snow. The house behind them glowed warm. Grace looked up at the sky, stars faint through city light, and whispered to herself, "Some homes aren't built with walls but with people who stay." Ethan reached for her hand, tentative, as if asking permission from fate itself. She let him hold it. Inside, the fire burned low, but its light reached every corner of the house. The Grayson estate no longer felt like a monument to grief. It was something simpler now, fragile, human, alive. And though the world outside still whispered its judgments within those walls, 3 souls had begun to learn what it meant to stay. Perfect. I'll now write part 3, 3,000 words in the same cinematic voice as the previous parts, with slow-burning emotional intensity, rhythmic prose built for narration. No headings or dashes, and a bittersweet, emotionally cathartic ending. The tone will be mature, reflective, and deeply human, suited for a YouTube storytelling audience of older men who value redemption, loss, and meaning. The snow melted completely by early spring. The Grayson estate no longer looked like a monument of stone, but something alive, breathing in the soft air that drifted through open windows. Grace Carter moved through the halls with quiet familiarity now. Her footsteps no longer echoed. They blended with the hum of a house that had finally learned to be warm. Unity had become a national success. Her face appeared on magazines, her story quoted by journalists as the symbol of modern compassion. But fame carries its own cold shadow. Every compliment held a question, every praise came with doubt. She never asked for the attention, but the world had decided to watch her anyway. Ethan tried to shield her. He hired publicists, managed the interview, spoke softly when she looked exhausted. Yet she could feel him drifting. The man who had once watched her sing by the fire now spent long nights on calls, locked in meetings with lawyers. His eyes looked older. The more the company grew, the less room there seemed to be for peace. One night, she found him sitting alone in the study. The fireplace was cold. Papers covered the desk, numbers and contracts stacked in restless towers. He didn't look up when she entered. "You're still working," she said. He smiled faintly. "You sound like Mrs. Porter." She stepped closer. "You haven't eaten." He shrugged. "Appetite for people who sleep." Grace studied him, the way his hands trembled slightly when he turned a page. "You built this to heal," she said softly. "Now it's breaking you." He looked at her finally. Maybe healing always costs something. She wanted to argue, but the fatigue in his voice silenced her. She reached out, touched his shoulder, then left the room without another word. Weeks passed in fragments of calm and strain. Ella grew stronger, louder, her laughter a bright echo down the hallways. Grace sometimes caught herself thinking of her as her own child, and then immediately reminded herself of the truth. Love was not ownership. Love was presence. Still, when the little girl called her Mama, Grace didn't correct her. The storm came quietly, not with snow, but with headlines. A video leaked online. Grainy footage taken months ago showed Grace and Ethan in the nursery during the blackout, his coat around her shoulders, their faces close in the candlelight. The caption beneath the clip read, "Billionaire's maid becomes Mistress Unity. A lie, built on lust." Within hours, the story spread across every major network. Comments flooded the internet. Her inbox turned into a wall of hatred and mockery. When she entered the kitchen that morning, Mrs. Porter couldn't meet her eyes. Ethan was already in his office, surrounded by journalists at the gate. Grace didn't hide. She walked straight to him. "It's everywhere," she said. He nodded grimly. "I know." "What are you going to do?" she asked. He stared at the floor. "What do you want me to do?" "Tell them it's not true." He hesitated just long enough for her heart to crack. "If I deny it, they'll think we have something to hide. And if you don't, they'll destroy you." For a long time, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Maybe I should leave." He looked up sharply. "Grace, no. That's what they want." "Maybe it's what we need," she said. He reached across the desk, but she stepped back. "You told me once healing costs something. Maybe this is the price." That night, she packed a small suitcase. Ella was asleep, her tiny hand clutching the stuffed bear Grace had sewn for her. Grace kissed her forehead, whispered, "Be good," and walked out before the dawn. She didn't leave a note. She couldn't bear to write goodbye. The city swallowed her easily. She found a modest apartment above a bakery, took a consulting job for a non-profit, using Unity's platform. She kept her hair tied back, wore glasses, disappeared into routine. For the first time in months, no one recognized her face. The silence was both mercy and punishment. She missed Ella every morning. She missed Ethan most at night. 3 months passed before the knock came. She opened the door to find Mrs. Porter standing there, older somehow, clutching a small envelope. "He's not well," the woman said. Grace froze. "What happened?" "He's been sick for weeks. Doctors say exhaustion, stress. But it's more than that. He doesn't eat. He barely speaks. He asked for you." Grace returned to the estate the next evening. The gates looked taller, the house larger, the air thinner. Inside, the rooms felt too quiet. Ethan was in the study again, thinner, paler. surrounded by silence. When he saw her, he smiled faintly as if seeing something from a dream. "You came," he said. "You asked," she replied. They sat across from each other by the fire. For a long time neither spoke. The years of distance between them melted in the heat. Finally he said, "You built something beautiful and I ruined it." She shook her head. "You didn't ruin it. You forgot why you started." He exhaled a sound between laugh and sigh. "I wanted to fix the world so I wouldn't have to fix myself." Grace looked into the fire. "You can still start over." At my age, he asked, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Starting over isn't about years," she said. "It's about breath." Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder. The storm rattled the windows, thunder murmuring somewhere beyond the trees. They sat together until midnight. She sang softly, almost under her breath, the same lullaby she had sung to Ella 2 winters ago. Ethan closed his eyes. When the song ended, he whispered, "You know she still wakes up asking for you." Grace's voice broke. "She'll forget eventually." "No," he said quietly. "She won't." The next morning, Grace went to the nursery. Ella was there, taller now. Curls wild, smile wide. When she saw Grace, she ran across the room, shouting her name. Grace lifted her, spun her once, both laughing through tears. "You came back?" the child said. "Just for a visit," Grace whispered. The little girl frowned. "But visits end." Grace kissed her forehead. "Some don't." For a week, Grace stayed helping Mrs. Porter, spending quiet evenings with Ethan and Ella. The gossip faded as new scandals took its place. Unity continued under new management. Grace avoided interviews, content to live in the small corners of the house that felt human. She thought she might leave again when the season changed, but something held her there a little longer. One afternoon, she found Ethan outside near the old greenhouse, staring at the empty flower beds. She loved tulips, he said when she joined him. "Lauren. She used to plant them every spring. I let them die after she left." He knelt, touching the soil. "Seems wrong to let a place stay empty." Grace crouched beside him. "Then let's plant something new." They worked in silence, hands dirty, clothes streaked with earth. When they finished, the beds looked like promise. That night, after Ella was asleep, Grace found him in the kitchen pouring tea instead of whiskey. He handed her a cup. "I've been thinking," he said, "about selling the company." She blinked. "You'd walk away from everything." "It's not everything anymore," he said. "It's noise. I want quiet." She studied his face, saw the calm resolve there. "What would you do then?" "Live," he said simply. "Maybe somewhere near the ocean. Somewhere she can run." He didn't have to say who he meant. The following week, the sale made headlines. Grayson Tech sold for a sum that stunned the market. Analysts speculated about his motives, but Ethan didn't speak to any of them. He disappeared from the city with Ella, moving into a small coastal town where the air smelled of salt and freedom. Grace visited once, planning to stay only a day. She stayed a month. They lived simply. Mornings by the water, afternoons tending flowers, evenings reading by the fire. For the first time in years, none of them needed to pretend. Yet peace carries its own ache. One evening, Ethan coughed violently, the sound sharp and wet. He waved it off, but the episodes grew. The doctor called it pneumonia, treatable but risky given his exhaustion. Grace sat by his bed every night, Ella curled at her feet. On the third night, he took her hand. "If I don't wake tomorrow, promise me something," he whispered. She gripped his fingers. "Don't talk like that." "Promise me," he insisted, eyes steady. "Take her somewhere she can be free. Don't let this house become another cage." Grace nodded through tears. "You'll tell her yourself." He smiled weakly. Maybe I already have. He passed away before dawn. The sea was quiet, the sky pale with first light. Grace sat beside him, long after the doctors left, holding his hand until the warmth faded. Ella slept in the next room, unaware that her world had shifted again. When Grace finally stood, she felt both hollow and full, as if love had carved a space inside her too deep for sorrow to fill. The funeral was small, private. No reporters, no speeches. Just wind, sea, and a handful of people who had known the man behind the myth. After the service, Grace took Ella's hand and walked down to the shoreline. The child threw a single tulip into the waves. "For Daddy," she said. Grace whispered, "For peace." They stayed by the ocean for months after. Grace took over a small community center, using Unity's model to help local families. Ella went to school, grew brighter each day. Sometimes at sunset, Grace would stand on the cliff and feel the wind lift her hair, carrying faint echoes of a man's voice, and the laughter of a child who once cried for warmth in a cold house. Years later, people would ask her how she endured it all. The scandal, the loss, the weight of being both savior and sinner in the eyes of strangers. She always gave the same answer: "I didn't endure. I loved." And love is heavier than endurance, but softer to carry. On the anniversary of Ethan's passing, she visited the garden they'd planted together. The tulips had bloomed red and gold against the green. Ella, now 7, ran between them, laughter scattering like petals. Grace closed her eyes and let the sound fill her chest. When she opened them again, she looked toward the sea and whispered, "We kept your promise." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the light caught the windows of the house and turned them gold. Inside, photographs lined the mantel. Ethan, Lauren, Ella, and Grace, 4 lives tangled by pain and chance, bound by something deeper than blood. A home that had once been built on silence now held only memory, and memory was enough. That night, as she tucked Ella into bed, the little girl asked, "Do you think he can see us?" Grace smiled softly. "I think he's the reason the stars stay on." Ella yawned, half asleep. "Will we stay here forever?" Grace brushed a curl from her forehead. "Forever's a big word," she said. "But for now, yes." When the house grew quiet, Grace stepped outside. The sea shimmered under moonlight. She felt the ache of everything lost and the calm of everything found. It was not happiness exactly. It was something truer. The kind of peace that comes when you've loved completely and survived it. The wind rose, carrying the faint scent of tulips. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from a ship leaving the harbor. Grace watched it disappear into the dark and whispered, "Go well." Then she turned back toward the lighted windows of the small house on the hill where a child dreamed, and the world for a moment felt forgiven. And as the night deepened, the ocean kept its rhythm, the same rhythm that had once echoed in the lullaby of a maid who slept on the floor beside a crying child in a house that had forgotten warmth but learned how to remember.